Good morning. My name is Crystal Brackey, and I am a part of the 1999 North Carolina Corps. It's wonderful to see all of you interested in this conversation about education policy, current and soon-to-be Corps members, alumni working inside and outside of education, and many special guests. I imagine that even with the different lenses each of us brings to this discussion, many of us are often circling around similar questions. For me today, as a newly elected school board member in my community of Richfield, Minnesota, the biggest question is how to cut through the competing and at times contradictory research and efforts and initiatives that seem to emerge and disappear nearly every day. How can I understand and best advocate for policies that will contribute to excellence and equity for our students, their families, and for our teachers and staff? I'm here to introduce the person who will be leading us through this conversation for the next 90 minutes, Andy Rotherham. Andy is a co-founder and partner at Bellwether Education Partners, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting innovations in education and improving educational outcomes for our country's underserved students. He is also a prolific writer. You may have seen his work as the executive editor of Real Clear Education, as a contributing editor to U.S. News and World Report, or his own blog, EduWonk. As a longtime reader, I will put in a personal plug for EduWonk. It's a great source of the latest in ed policy studies and meaningful opportunities in the field. We're so pleased to have Andy with us to moderate this discussion with the three panelists you will soon meet. So please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you. We're gonna have to, there we go. I thought we were gonna have to use our teacher voice. All right. How is everyone? Everyone rested, got to bed early, sober, good night's sleep? All right. Well, we're gonna try to keep it a little bit more conversational and upbeat. I don't know who would be less fun for our panelists or you guys if you just got talked at for 90 minutes. So we're gonna have a conversation, and then we're gonna leave plenty of time for questions and engagement with you all. You can see there's two mic stands. I'm gonna briefly introduce our panelists, but I think over the course of this conversation, you're gonna get a sense a little bit more of who they are. Right here immediately on my right is John Schnur. John's held a number of roles in education dating back 2 decades in the nonprofit sector and in the public sector. Right now he advises Bloomberg Philanthropies, he's at American Achieves, and he's somebody who's been an architect of a lot of the ideas and strategies that we're going to be talking about today. Hannah Skandera is also a veteran of the public sector and nonprofit sector. She's in the public sector right now as state superintendent in New Mexico, and you'll be hearing a little bit more about that. Mike Johnson, also a number of different roles with John, co-founded New Leaders for New Schools. He's a state senator in Colorado and has been really instrumental there on education, and that's the thing people pay attention to, but also on a number of other issues, and has had a fascinating political rise and a real impact in a relatively short time in Colorado. So what we're going to talk about, this is a tumultuous time in education, as you all know. It used to be, I think, when we got into this, it was tumultuous nationally. It didn't necessarily percolate down to the classroom, but what's happening now is it affects everything, including affects what goes on in classrooms. There's real splits in the education world. There's real splits in what you might call the education reform world about what's working, where to go, new directions. There's a lot of ideology. Some of this stuff is almost religion, but there's also just a lot of unknowns and a lot of things that people are learning and trying to figure out, and failures and successes. And that's what we're going to talk about, because I think today, if you look, even the very best schools are not doing what we need them to do in terms of really getting all kids to where we want them to be. And we're still faced with this basic challenge of making what we know is possible, not only possible for some kids, but probable for many, many more Americans than it is today. And so we've got just a terrific group of people who have been from across the political spectrum, have been involved in this, to have this conversation. But to start, I'd ask you guys just to help orient us very briefly, just define the problem, because I think different people in this sector are actually trying to solve potentially different problems. So Mike, I'll start down here with you. Let's come down. when you work on education and your work now, like, what is the problem fundamentally that you are setting yourself to try to solve?
Thanks, Andy, and great to be here. Amazing crowd this morning, so yes, we will keep it moving and lively. I think, and we'll talk a little about looking back over what the successes and maybe mistakes I have. When I think about what the problem is now or what the opportunity is now, I think it is a question of deploying four key things in the same places at the same time. It's an alignment question of people, of programs, of policies, and of politics. What we've found is over the last 15 years, we've built individual little oases where we might be doing one of those things right. We might have a good policy framework in a given city, but not a talent pipeline of great teachers and principals to help execute it. We might have a couple of highly talented school leaders, but they're working in a policy framework that makes it so impossible for them to succeed, they can't fundamentally break through. And so I think the question now is about what can we do to make sure we have ecosystems that have all of those things aligned, that have a strong talent line of people, that have the right policy framework to help them succeed, have world-class programs, meaning nonprofits and schools and the rest that are building those proof points, and have managed the politics so you don't have 2 or 3 years of great success and then you lose a school board election and the whole thing goes underwater. And so for me, it's a question of alignment of those four things now, and it's a question of execution on those four things.
Terrific. Hannah?
I wouldn't disagree with what you said, and I would just add that it's connecting our dots and not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think we've learned an incredible amount over the last decade or two when it comes to the reform movement and the propensity to overreact and actually miss all the work that's been done, but to take what's been done, whether it's the capital pipeline, the policies, et cetera, and bring them into alignment, yes, and not throw out what we've learned, but build on it.
So first, thank you so much for being here today. This is an amazing opportunity for people from across the country to compare notes, share ideas, improve what you're doing individually, what we're doing collectively, and it's great to be part of this. I'm really glad, Andy, you asked this question. Everyone in this room, and everyone watching this live stream, I guess, and everyone goes into teaching, who work on education, virtually everyone shares ultimately caring for children. We're united by a sense of we're here for what's better and best for our children, and that unites us. What I think we miss often, before we go to the policies, which we'll do, we don't do what design thinking. Some of you know design thinking is actually an interesting field which says, you know what, if you go right to the solutions, but you don't carefully define the problem you're trying to solve first, of course helping our children, of course helping education. But what's the problem? You actually you're across the board, you're not even using the same language for what your solutions are. And so I think, I'll share my view, but I think for each of you, and for every community and every state across the country, having a careful definition of the problem you're trying to solve, individually and talking about that together, is a crucial process step before setting policy. That said, my view, but have the discussion, is the big problem we face and the big opportunity we face right now related to education is the following. The world has changed dramatically in the last 10, 20 years, and the pace of change is increasing. And we haven't kept up with the pace of change by equipping our youth with what's needed in a vastly different economy, society, change-filled world. And simply what that means is, some people think in education, say the problem is we failed in our schools and failed in education systems. That's not true. We haven't failed. Some people say education's fine. Oh, you know what? Education's doing fine, good enough. Education's not the vehicle to improve opportunity. Education's not fine. And what's happened is that we actually have made in our country over the last couple of decades, and it continues, improvements in education. We're getting better than ever. But we're actually getting better while falling behind the higher bar that's been created by a changed economy. Just very briefly, what I would say is, in 1973, 1 in 4 U.S. jobs required a post-secondary degree, 1 in 4. The middle class, you get to the middle class by a high school degree. Today, over 2 in 3 U.S. jobs require a post-secondary degree and a higher level of skill. And by the way, good jobs, there's a study that came out showing that out of the 2.9 million jobs, good jobs with good salaries, full benefits, full-time, created since 2009, over 95% of those require some kind of post-secondary degree. And the level of skill's gone up in terms of not just rote memorization, but higher level. So we've made improvements. We were number 1 in the world, my last point for the problem definition, we were number 1 in the world in 1995 in the percentage of young people with getting college degrees. We're number 1 in the world. And we've actually have now more young people getting college degrees. And we've slipped to number 13. So we're getting better, but falling behind to some extent other countries, but more importantly, the opportunity that education is designed to provide our youth for. And the question isn't how we fix failure, how we maintain the status quo or swing from one side of the pendulum, swing to the other, but how do we, using the evidence, how do we move forward so we help our young people keep pace of the changing world? That's my definition of the problem.
Terrific. And I want to come back in a little bit to something in terms of that, how we're thinking about this from a design perspective and the people who are leading and how they may be thinking about it. But to stay on sort of getting us caught up to kind of where we are, Hannah, when you look back, like the last 10, 15 years, maybe to like No Child Left Behind, I mean, there was, the Clinton administration, you had charter schools, you had the beginning on accountability and standards, and there was, the National Summit when he was a governor. But this current round, I think you can really trace, to No Child Left Behind, this current push for reform up through the Obama administration of the present day. When you look at that sort of writ large, what do you see as sort of, big spikes high where there's been real success and progress, big spikes low where things have failed? Sort of, how do you sort of handicap the field right now?
So I'm an optimist, so I really believe incredible things have happened. Not because they've been accomplished perfectly, not because there's not incredible things to learn, but we've established a baseline, in my opinion, when it comes to excellence and an expectation for our students, but also all the people that make our students, that give our students the possibility. And so when I think about it, I believe that while they're not sexy, the systems that are being talked about, creating lots of tension across the nation today, whether it's a teacher evaluation, it's new standards, a new assessment, these are pillars. They're pillars and a foundation that we can build on. And not because, like I said, we got there perfectly, but because we actually have them, and the meaningfulness behind them is incredible. And I will do I get 30 more seconds?
As we say in Washington, we'll yield
Thank
to
you.
the gentle lady
So-
from
Gentle
New
lady from
Mexico.
Mexico.
And sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here's my picture. I have a little sister in the Big Brother Big Sister program. My little sister had a parent-teacher conference I got to go to, which is awesome. And so listen, she's amazing. She's 95s and 100s in everything she's doing. So we're closing. Her mom's proud. I'm proud. She's proud. And I said, I just one quick question: is she on grade level? And the answer was no. And she was third in her entire school, by the way, in her spelling contest, and she's not the top grade. I mean, she is knocking it out of the park at her school. But in that very moment, we had the opportunity, we had a standard. Her mom immediately went, wait a minute. Her mom engaged. She asked for options. She asked for choices. So in 30 seconds in a parent-teacher conference, the conversation we were able to have within the last year could have never been had a decade ago. So my little sister is now in a charter school, I might add, where her mom was able to advocate. She knows where she stands and knows the gaps and where she's going. Her mom is engaged and empowered to be a part of that. Never before would we have had that opportunity. So as I look at where are we today, we've got a ton to do, right? But let's not forget also what we're building on and make sure that we steward that, refine it, not leave it behind.
Mike, what would you add to that, and how do you, when how the last 10, 15 years, when people ask you, what do you say? How are we doing a good job, a mixed job, a poor job? Where are we?
So I think the two fundamental things we've tried to accomplish over the last 10 to 15 years are, one, can we get better information about how everyone in our system is doing, about how students are doing, how teachers are doing, how principals are doing, period. And the second is, can we make informed decisions without information? I think those two are fundamental building blocks that every educator has to have, right? Every responsible, high-performing teacher I've ever observed does an exit ticket on the way out every day, every other day. Why? Because they want to know where each of the 25 kids in that room are so they can know where to start the next day. So I think that's the success. I think the debate is all about what information do you gather and what decisions do you make afterwards. And I think those are valid debates. I think there's a lot of us who will say, I have 3 kids of my own. I care deeply that my kid can read on grade level. I also care deeply that my kid is a good human being and is kind and treats other people with respect. And so I would be the first to say that the entire measure of a child is not going to be their math performance. But I also believe that one of the core things we ought to offer as educators, as someone who looks at the state budget where we spend almost 50 cents of every dollar in K-12, we do it because we believe the most significant investment we make is in helping prepare kids to lead our state for the next generation. And they both have to be good human beings to do that. They also have to have the literacy and the math and the critical thinking to do it. So I think that's where the debate is healthy right now, is we know we need information. We know we have to make decisions on information. The question is just what information for what decisions.
John, what would you add about, you've looked at this over the last 15 years from a couple of different vantage points. Like, where are we? What's working? And in general, we're going to get down to specifics on some of these policies, but in general, what's working, what's not?
So I think you look at any period of change, whether it's the country level, the state level, school level. I think first I think it's important to look at outcomes for the youth that we're caring about and investing in here. And secondly, in terms of more of the policies or the strategies. And often people go right to the policy or strategy without saying what's working and being open-minded. People get attached to policies because they believe in them ideologically. We should do things because they work for kids, and if they don't, then it ought to change. So from an outcome perspective, I just want to briefly start. Across the last 15 years, 15, 20 years, the data will show on not just on test scores, which is only one measure. We'll talk about testing, but on other measures, high school graduation, college enrollment, access to rigorous classes. The data actually shows that there's been some progress in the country over the last 15 years. High school graduation rates reached a record high this year of 82%. Dropout rates had been reduced significantly, especially for African American youth and Latino youth. We've had improvements in the percentage of our young people and numbers of people going to college. Achievement levels have actually, particularly for kids of color and low-income kids and youth, gone up. Sometimes the gap's closing, sometimes it's not. So actually there are positive trends. I think it's really important for all the people who've been working in the classrooms and the schools and communities to know the efforts are paying off some. And that's really important to know. And by the way, there's some real bright spots that have actually shown even greater success. That said, the opportunity gap, I think there's evidence to show the opportunity gap is actually growing. And that's part because the rising bar of the economy and the wage differential, the employment differential between getting a high school degree or not and the skill level or not means you're getting somewhat better. It's not keeping up, particularly for those youth in need. So I think what it means is that we have to look at what's working, deepen and broaden. We have to look at our schools, but we also got to look at early childhood. We got to look at college. We got to look at healthcare. We got to look at a bunch of things in order to make sure housing, to make sure we're helping lift our youth up. So that's the outcomes. Very briefly in terms of what you're asking about on the policy side, just on what the last 15 years have been. I mean, just briefly, I think 3 things I'd pick out that have worked well and have been important, and 3 things that I think have been mistakes that I think should be learned from, in my view. This is one person's view. Number 1, in terms of what's worked, I think the country over the last 15, 20 years has focused on the achievement and opportunity gap for low-income kids and kids of color in a way the country had not before. It simply wasn't part of the conversation, honestly, before the mid-1990s, where our low-income and kids of color were in terms of the actual achievement that would equip them for opportunity. And No Child Left Behind, with all of its faults, and we can go into all the faults, there are many, but I think the idea of shining a spotlight nationally and by state onto where our kids of color, kids in low-income, kids with special needs weren't up to where they needed to be was very important. Number 2, I think we then had a period of kind of dumbed down tests, which had 2 high standards. In the last, we actually raised our standards, critical thinking, problem solving skills, setting the standards, not necessarily getting kids there. And I think the third thing is we've got growing numbers of schools, classrooms, even a few school systems showing success is possible, that you really can make progress, not perfection, but progress in schools and actually some school systems with different strategies. 3 mess ups, I would say, or 3 mistakes. I think just in my view, important to be candid to any of us, you're involved in things, you gotta say what's worked, what hasn't. Number 1 is, I think that there was an effort in the last 15 years to focus on standards and accountability without deep investment in scaffolding and support for both students and educators. Not everywhere. There are places that do, and the successes do it. I mean, but from a policy level, I was in a classroom in last week, and it was an amazing classroom where a teacher had really high math standards for the kids, but she was giving scaffolding, like bit by bit, the kids were solving these math problems on their own and building on it and saying, let's build on each other's ideas so we can actually understand what the meaning of 37 times 17 is. Similarly, at the adult level, we need more scaffolding, curricula, instructional leadership, time, support for educators to work on the higher standards. That was one mess up. Second, I think there's a quote from Michael Barber I think is very important. Michael Barber worked for Tony Blair, the Prime Minister in England, on reforms in the UK in the 1990s. And he has a quote saying, you can mandate improvements, but you can only unleash greatness. My addition to that would be, you can mandate improvements, and you only can expect, invest in, and then unleash greatness. I think too many of the policies across the spectrum have mandated prescription as opposed to empowering people at the local level, and that needs to be balanced. And then the third and final mess up, I think, is that there has been an excessive focus on testing. We need better tests, well-used tests. It's one important measure, it's not the only one. I think we have to do a bit of a course correction on that.
And I see you itching to get it.
I don't disagree with you at all, but I'd put maybe a few finer points and/or additions. One, I look at this room, and one of the things that I think has happened in the last 10, 15 years that is a product of some of the things you're talking about is people. There are people all over this nation now that have an incredible, and this is the unleashing piece, right? You're the unleashers. And at the end of the day, I think we have succeeded in the sparking, the fire of, and the possibility of our teachers, our school leaders, and focused on that in a way that we have no idea what's coming in the best sense. Secondly, I would also, just to push a little bit on what you said, it's not that I agree that the obsessive focus on testing and everything isn't a mishit in some ways, but I question, sometimes you've got to do the foundation so you can have the other conversations. The conversation, the luxury of sitting in this chair, you sitting in your chair today, it's a luxury. It's a luxury because we have a baseline and a foundation of things to talk about and build on and talk about how do we unleash greatness, because we know what greatness is. We have a standard. And so I think part of the piece for me is, at the end of the day, you've got to have one to be able to have the conversation about the other. And I'm excited because we're starting to have the conversation. And the other, to me, is a lot about human capital and unleashing that greatness.
So I want to, before we dive into specific policies, I want to pick up on one thing that was said. So these sort of various thrusts and what was done, and sort of how they were designed, this design thinking idea that John put on the table. And Mike, I want to ask you to start. Everyone leading this, and Hannah talked about the people in the chairs out here, the people in the chairs over here, everyone in this movement in an influential position was almost overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but almost overwhelmingly was good at school, enjoyed school, was good at it, succeeded at it in various ways. And that's sort of true of our education system in general, and yet we're trying to essentially, the data John was talking about, like help a population that traditionally has not gone as far in school go much further and succeed. And you were a principal, and I know just talking with you about sort of your experiences now in the community with work that you do, like we're trying to solve a problem for a lot of people who don't enjoy school, and in many cases with very good reason, because schools can be very unpleasant the way it's presented, who aren't necessarily good at school, who are struggling. So, I guess the blunt way to ask this question is like, are we exactly the wrong people to be doing design thinking around this? And sort of more generally, how much has that maybe created blind spots over the last 10 or 15 years in some of these approaches that have created backfire potential?
So I don't think we are, for a couple of powerful reasons. So I mean, in my mind, not knowing that you're sick doesn't make you well. Right? And so I think there's the only world in which you would believe that is a world in which you believed someone had a terminal illness. The only world in which you wouldn't tell someone that they had a need or a malady was a world in which you believed they had a terminal illness that was incurable. Right? There's nothing I can tell you that will help you ameliorate your situation. If that's the belief we have about kids who are low performing or who have learning disabilities or who are challenged, it makes a statement about our belief about the permanence of their capacity.
Right, but is that the question though, or is the issue more like we're designing schools that worked well for people like us, but they may not achieve?
I think the school design question is another question. I think this is an assessment and information question, which is, if you had a sixth grader who's reading at the second grade level, would you want to do that? Would you want to know that? And what actions would you take? I have 3 kids now, and I have some kids that do far better academically than others. And that makes it a harder and a different conversation for the child that struggles than the one that doesn't. But I find that when you look around wealthy communities in America, they still are sending 90% of kids to college. Right? They're not saying, I have one child who doesn't do as well in school, and so I'm not going to send them to college, knowing that 90% of the jobs require a college degree or a post-secondary degree. They're saying, I will find a post-secondary environment that fits for you. And it might cost $50,000 a year, and that's a challenge. But I think what we do in most cases is the expectations we have for our own kids or our own families are, you may have certain weaknesses, you may have certain strengths, but I'll build a program around your strengths. And so I think what we've had now is the reason why this information is so important is it allows parents and families to say, build a system around your strengths. And then I think we as school designers, teachers, school leaders, have the responsibility to make sure there's a real broad portfolio of options that wouldn't just appeal to the type of school I would have wanted to go to, but to the type that all of our kids would want to go to.
Hannah, I see. Are you worry some days that like you're designing a school system that worked really well for people like you, but may not? Does that?
I can say that since we're having a conversation, I've certainly been accused of that on multiple levels. I get to work in New Mexico, and 60% of our kids are Hispanic, 12% are Native American, and I have been called Scandero as my last name, but it's Scandera, and I'm very white. And I've been, the question is, do you really understand, right? And I guess going to the core of why I do what I do and do I believe we can do better and all those things, absolutely. But I think part of the conversation we should be having around the reform movement, in answer to your question, yes, I believe we're the right people to be in. We just need so many more. And part of our charge in this moment is to look, if we're running a race and we're carrying a baton, are we making sure we're running in a way that we can pass the baton and or run alongside? And how many more runners are we bringing into the race? It's not, should I step out? It's how should I run and who am I running with and how many more can we bring? And I think there's a tension there. And we're probably not walking it out perfectly, but I firmly believe that there's room for everyone, not just one person or another because of whether it's race, color, or economic status. I think that that's part of our charge right now and something we're challenged with and don't do it very well.
So we've been talking for almost 20 minutes, and that was Hannah's first running metaphor, which I think is a record for those of you who know her. John, when you think about this design thinking question.
So I was this week talking with a group of students on the west side of Chicago, and I learned a lot from them, as all of us do when we spend time with students. And there was an 8th grade African American boy who I asked what he liked about his school. And he said he liked history. My son loves history too. I said, what do you like? He said, well, you know what, in history, we're learning about the civil rights movement, but we're not only learning about Martin Luther King, who was amazing and gave these speeches, provided the leadership, but we're learning about all these people you've never heard of, who actually played a crucial role in the civil rights movement. And he said, the names aren't known, and they do their thing, and they make progress, and then they don't get all the way there, and people that come behind them take it at the next level. He said, in our school, we do the same. We're working, and we do a project, and this year we don't get all the way, but then the next grade comes behind us and builds on that. And my view is very relevant for this work in education. I think people who've been doing the work in education, including leadership roles, Hannah and Mike and leaders around the country, you all, people who've been leading improvement and change are heroes for what we've done. And the question is, there's kids and parents and community leaders who have, but what I will say is that there hasn't been, I would say, enough there's been progress, and the pendulum should not swing back this way. We can't throw away progress. It's real and important progress with great leadership. But I think there's a sense in this country, ultimately we're founded on the idea of self-determination. And there's theories about this for kids, but for the country, for communities. And I do think there's a need to build on the good work that's been done, but including in the very definition of what success is, to have much broader involvement across communities, across racial lines, across ages, across every vantage point. So what really is meaningful for us in terms of what we want for success in our schools? So we'll get to the policy discussion on ESSA accountability, but my view is there should be some important threshold goals in having academic achievement that actually tests, that measure whether kids can read deeply, write effectively, use math to solve a problem. Crucial. Graduate from high school, get enrolled in college. But I think there can be room in the accountability systems that relate to this for how to, at a very differentiated level, if there are a few things that affect everyone across the state, can communities come together and say, what's really important to us? Let's really talk about it. Let's have things that might not have been designed by somebody in the legislature or by somebody in this room or the panel, but in the end we come to a few of these things matter. While most of the accountability system ought to focus on a small number of outcomes across schools, I think there's room to define a supplementary set of things that are different, and I think the process of people being involved in defining what success is will create much more ownership and sense of momentum toward accomplishing all these goals.
That's terrific. And let's dive down into some specific policies. And I think a really illustrative one over the last decade or so is teacher evaluation, where the field essentially went from basically evaluating no one to deciding we were going to evaluate everybody. And the New Teacher Project had a lot of data on this. It was very influential. The Obama administration made it a key component of the race to the top. And it's become a thrust. It's also become very controversial. And it ties together a number of these themes. Mike's point on we're trying to get information. People want to know, that's important. Hannah's point on sort of, people and people matter, and good people want to be evaluated and want feedback. And your point, John, on sort of we've just got to substantially up our game. But it's been contentious, it's been controversial. You guys have all played a role. So let's talk about teacher evaluation. Kind of where are we now, and what are some of the broader lessons that we should draw from that? And Mike, you championed landmark legislation in Colorado on this, so I'll start with you.
I was just thinking all of you youngsters in the crowd. When I came into TFA back in the day, I was talking to my girl Jen Crawford, who's somewhere, but when I came into the Corps in '97, now you have all these fancy like Suleiman Awards, and everyone has their growth measures each year. When I came into the Corps in '97, the way you knew who the awesome teachers were who the teacher was who had led the class trip to France the previous year. Like if you had like fundraised a trip to France and taken 10 kids to France, you were it. You were like, oh man, you must have an amazing classroom. And it gives you a sense for, right, like even in our self-proclaimed innovative educational approach, we had no information to base how well you were doing when the door closed with your kids in that classroom than anybody else did. We just thought, you know, or if you were charismatic or friendly, your kids hung out in your room after class, you must be great. And what we found, and Jim Collins found in Good to Great long before that, is that often those two things have no relationship to each other. How charismatic you are sitting in a teacher interview or how friendly you are at happy hour may have nothing to do with the relationship you have with your kids and the content you can deliver. And so I think the change for us, and for us, the whole purpose of evaluation is improvement. Right? The reason why you want better information is you need information to know how to improve your practice. And so our goal was always, can we get this data on what teachers are doing? What are our rock star teachers doing to get dramatic results with kids? And can we then use that to ask them to sit down and unpack the brilliance in their brain for the rest of us to share? And so the reason why we wanted every teacher evaluated every year, the reason why we wanted linked to student growth metrics, is we wanted to be able to say, are the things we're observing subjectively matched by what we're seeing objectively in the data? And if not, is the data wrong, or is our subjective evaluation wrong, or is there someplace in between? But until you start to ask that question, you know, we had kind of the early Jaime Escalante, like calculus AP exam success, but until you start to ask the question, what makes that instruction successful, and how can you replicate it, we can't get to scale. So I think that part of the conversation has been really, really successful. It will drive better professional development, better mentoring and peer support, better selection. I think the challenge is what is the perfect balance of what amount of data goes into a teacher evaluation? Should it be 40% student growth, 50%, 20%? Should it be 3 measures of student growth? Should it be 7? Should it be locally developed, teacher developed, state developed? What we've done in Colorado is said kind of yes and yes and yes. You should have one part of our outcomes have to be linked to how much students improve from the day they start in your class to the day they leave. And that measure ought to have multiple measures. It should never be one test, one day. It should be a portfolio of assessments, and that should be part of what you use to measure impact, but not all of it. And at the end of the day, our evaluation system always leaves the decision on hiring or firing someone in the hands of their supervisor. Our law never forces the firing of a single teacher over a single principal. It does say we will make transparent what that person's performance is, and then if you know they lost their husband this year and it was a tough year, you have the decision to say, hey, here's how we can help you get better. But what we wanted to insist on was the clarity and the consistency of that data, with the idea that that data is what you could use to help yourselves get better.
And what would you do differently? Like, looking at this now, so there's been some changes as was implemented. Like, what are your big takeaways? And as we think about the next generation of reform, like, how should your experience there, and the experience of Colorado, how should that inform us?
One of the best things we did, which was not my idea, was we really went slow in the implementation. So we passed our bill almost 5 years ago. This year is the first year of full statewide implementation because we spent 2 years with a team of teachers helping design what our evaluation system would look like. You know, what does it look like to be a good teacher? We spent several years piloting those assessments in small districts and then larger groups. We spent 1 year deploying the evaluation system statewide, but without the consequences attaching to them. And so we really inched into, can you really build some beta tests on these and make sure you improve the practice along the way? I think to John's earlier point, the best thing we did, which a nonprofit in Colorado did, is we spent in a number of districts, we spent a great deal of time working with teachers and principals to train them on how to use those evaluation tools and what they meant, and modeling classroom walkthroughs together. And those are the places that by far have the strongest feedback, strongest success early on. So I think I'd agree with John that if we had done more investment early on at the state level in professional development, support, and training, I think we did a great job including teachers in the design. I think we need to include more of them in the initial training.
And how has that affected the politics? So this sort of slower rollout you're talking about, like, I mean, initially it was very controversial. There was a lot of resistance. Has that slow rollout like helped ameliorate some of the politics, or essentially it's just the politics are going to be the politics?
I think it has helped in a significant way, and one of the most significant ways it happened, which is interesting, is when we had the debate in our state, as we did in a lot of places, about rolling back the standards or rolling back the assessments. There was a lot of political battle around that. One of the loudest voices of folks who came to the Capitol and said, don't change the standards and don't change the assessments. We just spent 3 years training ourselves to use them better, were the teachers. Who said, to you this might be some sort of political football. To us, we've invested a great deal of our time and energy in learning these standards, being prepared to deliver them, and then feeling like we have an assessment that fairly measures them. And so I think there's been a deeper demand from educators to want that alignment than if we had pushed it more quickly.
Okay, and Hannah, I want to hear about the New Mexico experience, but John, Race to the Top, which you were there helping to design, obviously incentivized this a great deal. Human capital was a major part of the point scoring system, so states went after this. And then in Colorado, even states that didn't end up ultimately being Race to the Top winners were still making big changes. It sparked just a great deal of change.
We won round 3, known as the Booby Prize.
The door prize, yes.
Yeah.
Colorado got its door prize in round 3. But it incentivized a lot of action. Had a serious weighting on standardized test scores as part of teacher evaluation that some states have maintained, some states have walked away from, and so forth. Like, it undoubtedly catalyzed change, but when you look at that, like, how do you think about what happened, and did it overweight standardized test scores and create a backlash that might not otherwise have been there, or are those politics going to happen regardless?
It's a good question. One small factual correction, then I'll answer the broader question, which is the Race to the Top didn't actually weight standardized test scores. The weighting was determined at the state or local levels. There wasn't actually a weighting of the test scores and teacher evaluation. That's a smaller point.
But it emphasized using standardized test scores as your substantial measure.
The Race to the Top competition had one of the components was, do you have a strategy to get more well-prepared teachers to high-need schools, including a teacher evaluation system, of which one measure needed in the Race to the Top guidance needed to be standardized test scores. So in terms of your question about what happened, I just want to, I think President Obama deserves tremendous credit, in my view, for leadership in late 08, early 09. I was working with him through the end of the 08 and the first few months of 09 as the stimulus package was getting passed. We were about to head potentially in the second Great Depression. We lost 1 million jobs in the country over the course of 6 months. And the president not only had the leadership to invest in stimulation of the economy, which I think prevented the second Great Depression, but he, and I was involved, he was willing to say as part of this, which people were, I remember when he said he would do this and what people in the Congress said, he wanted to invest $100 billion as part of the stimulus package in education. And I remember the congressional leaders hearing that. People were a little shocked. Some of the Democrats who liked education didn't think about education being a big focus of the stimulus package. Some of the Republicans who might have liked education but didn't think about dollars for that. And the proposal was to put in money, which got passed, to prevent layoffs of hundreds of thousands of teachers at a time when the economy was crashing, to invest in greater Pell Grants, invest in Head Start, expand education opportunity, or at least protect funding around the country. And then a part of that, which was the $5 billion or $4 billion around the competition for Race to the Top and the Invest in Innovation Fund. So we said, you know what, we're going to give a lot of funding, we're also going to support states who want to take up the opportunity to lift standards, invest in teaching, drive continual improvement. And in terms of my view of the outcome of all of that, again, I think, and I'm biased, but I think the president brought a great leadership. I think had that not happened, we would have had 300,000 teachers lose their jobs and not be able to go in. We would have had less opportunity for college. And without Race to the Top, I actually think we would not have had nearly the momentum that is in the country. I think the most important thing is to lift the standards for our kids. As Mike said, in Colorado, they fought hard to make sure that in New Mexico and elsewhere, there really are rigorous standards and much higher quality assessments that actually reflect problem-solving skills, critical thinking skills, the skills that our kids really need to succeed, and don't have the dumbed-down, fill-in-the-bubble multiple-choice tests, but have much better assessments with performance tasks and writing tasks. I think that's been really a very important step in the country that was accelerated, in my view, by the Race to the Top component of the package. On teacher evaluation specifically, my view is that in terms of the way that kind of federal policy incentive that, I think there have been some places which have done teacher evaluation as part of a comprehensive strategy to invest in teachers well. And when you think about a system that develop teachers and support teachers, give feedback for teachers, ensure fair accountability, I think there are some places that have used Race to the Top funding to do not only the policy, but invest the dollars in doing that really well. But I also think, in my view, that in general, there was a momentum across the country where it went too far, too fast. Too many places that actually didn't have the capacity to really invest in the supports for teachers. People who didn't have the wisdom, if there wasn't the capacity right away, wisdom of Colorado to say, you know what, let's wait a few years. Let's actually invest in our teachers and principals first. And I think that there were places that moved too far, too fast without the support. And that, I think, was a real fallout And I think not only for teacher evaluation is a lesson learned, I think be building these good systems, keep going, but don't, but I think for any effort that any of you are involved in, when you see a really good idea, there are no quick fixes, and it's not easy to scale. So right now, I'll give you one example, I'll stop, but on education technology, for example, there's a ton of effort on education technology, computers in classrooms. I've seen schools where it's tremendous. There are schools that are transforming what's happening for kids. But I think people are taking it and they want a computer in every classroom, a laptop for every kid. They don't have a strategy for how it's actually not replacing good teaching, but matched with a deep investment in teaching. And you put all this investment, you take a good idea that over 20, 25 years could become transformational, and you go to too many places too fast, and most places it's not working. I think that there is some of that lesson from teacher evaluation. We shouldn't eliminate it. We should kind of move forward, give teachers feedback, give them support. But I think there's a lesson learned. Have a smaller number of places thoughtfully try it with the right timeline before taking any good idea you've got in policymaking to full state level scale or national scale quickly.
So Hannah, you've heard sort of Colorado's experience that Mike laid out and how they did it, John's take on Washington, and this point of it may have been too much too fast and have created some problems. We can talk more about that, and I'm sure we'll get to that during Q&A. How does that dovetail? Like, you lived this in New Mexico and led it. How does that fit with your experience?
So I think before answering that question, I think, and if I'm sitting in your chair and when I sit in mine every day, the first question you have to ask is, what's the context I'm in? I know we're talking about the national context, but so I'm going New Mexico. Because when you ask that question, the next question asks is, and what generation of reform am I in? There's a first generation where you're probably breaking a lot of things because you're changing systems. It's not comfortable, it's awkward, there's usually lots of battles. That might even be a nice characterization. And then there's the embedding and the transition to a next generation. I think about states like Louisiana or Tennessee, DC, where there's a baseline and then there's the implementation over time, et cetera. New Mexico, so I'm going to disagree based on the generation that New Mexico is in. We're a first generation. We're 49th in the nation in almost every student achievement measure. We have been for decades. So we can talk about slow and process, and I don't disagree. There's a time and a place for determining that. But in New Mexico, I fundamentally believe there's no wiggle room for wait. So yes, in the last 6 years, we've changed standards, assessments, teacher evaluations, school grading versus AYP, high school expectations for graduation that aren't 8th grade, because they were. New teacher prep programs, new pay performance for teachers. I mean, go down the list, the ecosystem around teachers, students, and school leaders has fundamentally changed on every level. And you know what? It is rocking the boat. And at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe, not because it's been perfect, but the pace, we didn't have a choice on our pace. Every little kiddo that goes through, and we were sitting as a state going, there was no expectation. We had to establish the bar and then aim high. So I think there's a place and a timing around implementation, and we implemented teacher evaluation in a single year. It was painful, not gonna lie. But we also now have a baseline where we can support our teachers in ways we never supported before. Yes, the local decision for hiring, firing, et cetera, it's still at the local level. I fundamentally believe in that. But we had to have information to actually support. We didn't have that before on any, whether it was our students, our teachers, our school leaders. And we did break a little glass. And I don't have regrets that there was some breaking because we needed to break through. And I fundamentally believe that's what's happening in New Mexico.
I want to stay on this, and I know you want to jump, because there's a tension here, right? Which is, we talk about the urgency, 9% of low-income kids getting a bachelor's degree by the time they're 24, what other countries are doing. John, the data you talked about, the really serious tectonic shifts in our economy and the skills and education you need to actually have opportunity. And then we also worry about the pacing. So is there a counter-argument here that we didn't go fast enough? And that, I mean, sort of to put it in the stimulus, a basic principle of federal budgeting is any dollar you spend ends up out there somewhere. And so at some level, if you take the values out of it, there's no difference between buying tanks and paying teachers. Like, that's money going to the economy. You just have to make choices. So we spent most of the money on saving jobs, some of it on reform. Is there an argument that, in fact, it should have been much more weighted towards reform. We should have gone much faster, and that more states are basically in the condition that Hannah's. I'd love to hear all three of you, because as we think about, it informs this question of, so what's for the next decade, as people think about moving more towards the vision of organizations like Teach for America. Should we be speeding up, going slower, the same?
There's a finer point to your question. Thought I'd help as the moderator.
Go.
So should we speed up? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about the federal government? Are we talking about the state? Are we talking about the district level? Are we talking about the classroom? And I think that question is really important. I prefaced my response and pushback on timing because from my view, I then articulated where New Mexico is. We have to ask where we are. If you're in your classroom, that's your sphere of influence. You've got to own and name what generation you're in with your kids, right? With a baseline. If you're leading a district, if you're leading a state, if you're leading a nation, there's the larger movement question, and then there's what sphere are you influencing, and I do think that matters.
I think so, but for the purpose of this conversation, I think there's more New Mexicos than there are Massachusetts, when you look at education outcomes in this country. So there's a problem of some severity. Reasonable people can disagree on this issue of pacing. That's what I want to talk about. But I think that there's more states that are close to the situation you're describing that are further along. So John, how should we be thinking about that for the next 10 years? Should we have been more aggressive? Should we be more aggressive going forward?
So I know we're going to, a little bit later in the panel, I guess, go more toward the future,
Yeah.
but I will just say...
I'm giving you an opening to go now.
The transition is that this is the federal policy just passed that opens up state policy making across the country over the next couple of years, represents a huge opportunity at the state and local level. I think people ask, well, what do you think of the new law? Well, I don't know yet, because ultimately what's going to depend on is what's going to happen in states and communities across the country in making decisions. So I think your question's a good question. It's not just an academic question, and it's also not a national federal question per se, in my view. It is a question that's very relevant for everyone across the country in states and communities making decisions about what comes next, including the pace of change. And I think that there are benefits to that, and there are risks of that because of the decisions historically that some states have made that have left kids who in most need behind. That said, on this particular issue, when I say I think that lots of great things have happened and I think some lessons learned, when I say too far, too fast, I don't mean that about every state and district. I think that some places actually going fast is really important. Massachusetts right now is the highest performing state in the country. It compares quite well globally. When the initial reforms were put in place in Massachusetts, they were going fast and there was intense pushback. Change is hard. This is a hard work. We're preparing kids for a new generation. Hard. Change is always hard. No one likes change usually when it's happening. Massachusetts went through a period when people were rejecting it. On the other side, it came out, and now Massachusetts is one of the best states in the country. Sometimes going fast is important. Just on teacher evaluation, look, Tennessee also went fast on teacher evaluation as a component of a broader strategy. And now there's data showing the overwhelming number of teachers in Tennessee think that actually the feedback they get for improvement is incredibly helpful, that it actually helps improve achievement for their kids, and that and the retention data is actually quite good for higher performing teachers and not as good for lower performing teachers. So I think there's data showing that after some real challenges that you can go fast and have it succeed. And Washington, D.C. is another example. Washington, D.C.'s moved fast as part of paying teachers much more, investing in teachers. Evaluation was one component of that. So I think going fast in a thoughtful way where you've got a systemic approach, investing in the capacity of kids can be good. I also think sometimes you say, you know what? Let's not go slow because it's hard. Let's go slow politically. Let's go slow because we need some time to build what's needed. I think that's also good. So I think that the key question, if you're in states across the country debating this, there is a risk that people are saying, you know what, this was hard, fast. Let's slow this all down. Let's actually not have higher standards. Let's not have accountability. Let's eliminate teacher relationships altogether. I think the pendulum in some ways has sort of swung here, and throughout American history we go back between the pendulum swinging this way and that way, and this way and that way. I think the key thing is to look at, okay, what's worked, what hasn't, and then come back in the middle and say, all right, let's for each state, what's the right approach that's really going to solve a very important, pressing problem for our kids in our country, and go somewhere in the middle and not go all the way back there that way. I think there's a risk we go too far. I think it's a very state and local decision, which is live in the next year or two.
So Mike, let's put this in everybody on this panel is served in public roles at the federal level, the state level, or both in a couple of our cases. But I think you're the only person on the panel who's ever had their name on a ballot, which is different, right? I mean, it's just fun. It's just a fundamentally different exercise. The rest of us have all been appointed. So, you're much more dialed in to, the political tensile strength of your district, your state, even nationally. How should we be thinking about this question? Like how fast can we go? How fast is too fast? Like in a leadership role like yours, how do you think about that?
So for me, the closest example is actually my work as a school principal. I think about it exactly the same as what I feel now as an elected official. So I think for us, it's not a question of fast versus slow. It's a question of the parity between expectations and support. And so what we used to say as a team of teachers running our school was, if you bring kids in and set really high expectations with very low levels of support, you set kids up for failure. And if you bring in a 9th grade reading at the 2nd grade level and say, here's War and Peace, go for it, I'll talk to you in 3 weeks, probably not going to go well. The reverse is also true. If you come in with very low expectations and very high levels of support, sort of, we'll baby you through everything, and if you just write a couple of words down, we'll feel so great about it, you set kids up for mediocrity. Right? The only real way you set them up for success is really high expectations coupled with really high levels of support. We're going to expect you to accomplish impossible things, but we will be here first thing in the morning when you get here, we'll be here at lunch, we'll be here after school, whatever resources you need, we'll deploy against it. And so I think the question of the slowness or the speed is a question of how strong can you deploy the support to match the pace of your expectations. If you're expecting dramatic overall change in expectations, you're going to need dramatic overall deployment of support to make that succeed. Because the question is not the inputs of what policies you can pass, it's the outcomes of what results you can change. And I think you can get policies passed quickly with high expectations and low support. I don't think you're going to get dramatic change in classroom and student behavior without some parity between expectations and support. So we knew we didn't have the resources to deploy the support as fast as we could deploy the policy change, and so we had to taper it until we had the support that could match it.
That's terrific, and I want to bring the audience in. So if you want to start coming up to the mics, you can go ahead and do it. There's one in each aisle, so we can get some questions. You can start doing that. It's going to take a little while to work through questions, so I don't know that everybody wants to do that, or you may be standing for a while, but there are the lines. You can start. While people are lining up, let's stay on this question of support very briefly. Have we done enough? I mean, one thing you don't hear a lot of conversations about in the reform world is school finance. I mean, there's some people who do some great work on that, but you don't hear as much about it.
You're bringing back my PTSD, Andy.
There's two issues. There's sort of overall spending levels, which we spend a lot of time talking about here in this town. But then there's also this issue of these tremendous inequities that exist within states, to some extent between states, but especially within states, often even within school districts, that systematically disadvantage certain kinds of students relative to other students. Like the support piece, where are we? What do we need to be doing around that support? And I realize that the support piece is broader than money, but let's talk about money, because that's a key component of it.
So this is, I will jump in. This is my one piece of homework I'm going to give you. This is my failure that you can learn from. I think I've spent the last almost 20 years of my career in education trying to figure out, like, how is it that America so perfectly propagates inequality generation over generation? Like, how is it that we have built an architecture of poverty that seems impenetrable in this country? And it took me 2 years to figure it out. And I would say, if you want to know the answer to that question, go home and study your state's School Finance Act. Because I will bet you it is almost the most perfect formula for propagating inequality that you can find. One quick example in Colorado, I didn't know this until Damien, who's here, and I spent a year and a half learning it. In Colorado, we spend statewide on students who are at risk, low-income kids, $200 million. That targets the 7 poorest counties, highest population of low-income kids and kids in poverty. We also have in our formula a weight called the cost of living adjustment, which is an adjustment we make for districts where it's expensive for teachers to live, which means that variable goes entirely to the 7 wealthiest counties in the state. It goes to Aspen and Telluride and Boulder and Cherry Creek and all those places you would imagine. $200 million statewide for low-income kids. Statewide, the size of the formula that goes to the wealthiest 7 counties, $1.2 billion a year. That is state law in the formula. So we tried to pass a ballot amendment to eliminate that $1.2 billion and spend it on kids that needed it the most. It didn't go so well.
That's where the political power is.
Yeah.
Is your pot windfall going to give you guys more money to?
No.
No?
Unfortunately, even if you all come to Colorado and smoke a lot of pot, it is not going to solve. I mean, you can do that anyway, but the great myth is that it's going to solve our education funding problem. It only raises about $35 million a year of funding, and I'm especially bitter because our school finance equity issue was on the same ballot as the pot tax. The pot tax passed with 55%. We lost by 66%. And so folks are willing to fund sin taxes. We couldn't make the case well enough. It was our fault to convince them that if you fundamentally want to change equity and outcomes, you have to look at not just the amount of dollars you spend, but how those dollars are spent and where they go. And our big bet was to say, take the kids who need you the most, low-income kids, kids who are learning English as a second language, and double down your bets on those kids. So under our new formula, if every kid got $7,000, the kid that walked into your class in October, 4 grade levels behind, recent immigrant, who doesn't speak English, that kid would have brought $15,000 with him, which means you start this market where now schools and principals and teachers fight to get the kids that need us the most, as opposed to try to turn them out the door because they don't bring the resources you need to support them.
Briefly, Hannah, John, this resource question. So,
I think, talk about pendulum swinging. I feel like there was a time when everyone talked about inputs as being the game changers. We had a pendulum swing and everyone said, no, it's the outcomes that are going, and I fundamentally obviously fall a little bit on that pendulum swing. And I think the next season that we're headed into is once again bringing those together in a balanced way. Mike started by talking about connecting some dots around human capital and programs, policies, and I mean, it is time to find the right balance because we haven't had it.
The United States, when you look at global comparisons, spends more money on education than most countries do. When you compare the United States to most countries on equity of spending, the United States is one of the few countries in the world that spends much more on our wealthier kids than our kids who are not wealthy. Many countries that get it right say, you know what, if our kids are further behind, let's actually give them more resources. We've kind of done the reverse. Now, I'm not suggesting we move resources from kind of the wealthy communities to the non-wealthy communities. I think we need an expansion of the pie overall, and we need more funding, as we see in some of the highest performing countries, for schools that need it most. And I think it's really crucial. I agree with Hannah in this pendulum swing. For a while, they talk about inputs. You got cities around the country that had huge amounts of funding go into those cities with no focus on expectations and standards and improvements and support for good teaching, getting instructional leadership, all the things that make a big difference. And you saw no outcome. So funding alone does not make a difference. At the same time, given the rising demand in this changing world that I talked about earlier, and the pressures that everyone in this country who works in education is under because of the changed economy to help our kids succeed more, that when you do just the standards and the expectations without the investments in funding, it is, one, it's not right, and it makes it much, much, much harder. You can't get as much progress, and it's harder on all the people doing it. So I think the answer needs to be both higher expectations and defined broadly in standards, including academic achievement more broadly, and also investment in more dollars, and more equitably distributed dollars.
terrific. All right, it's going to be great to bring you guys into the conversation. These are questions, and since we're in Washington, I do have to, a question is an interrogative. And it's setting up an answer. And so, and often in Washington, and particularly if you watch Capitol Hill, we're very good in this town at asking questions that are more expository, potentially in nature. And so we're going to stick to the interrogative, and I will interject. So please do that. And second, these lights are brutal, and so please be kind to all of us. If you're a sir and we call you ma'am or vice versa, be kind, because we can literally, you guys, we can barely see. You're all silhouetted to us. So over here at this microphone over here.
Hi, good morning. My name is John, and I'm a social studies teacher in Tennessee. And a lot of policy levers have been discussed this morning, and policy is just a selection of levers. Which one do you want to push? Which one do you want to pull? No one's brought up a lever that appears to be abandoned in America, and that's desegregation, both with race and with SES. And I feel as though that it was just seen as hard. And in the 60s, it was hard, and everyone's like, okay, we're done with this. And we don't do it anymore. Desegregation, that is. Now that the power's going back to the states in a lot of capacities on policy and levers, like, where do we go from here? What is the next step? Because it's a proven tool to get increased results for children of all types and of all backgrounds to succeed, but no one seems to have the political will to do it.
So you guys, who wants to take that? And also in the context of it's getting harder to desegregate schools because the share of white students overall is declining, and so that's one reason you're seeing the numbers skew the way they do. So with those the politics and the demographics, how do we do this?
I'll jump into this. I deeply agree with you. I think it is when you remember the I Have a Dream speech, it was not that all of my kids will be able to go to a great school that's all black. It's that one day my children will be able to hold hands with little black boys and little white girls. And so I think that part of the conversation has been lost from American civic life in a really profound way. I'd say there are some challenges. One is the United States Supreme Court, which there were, Seattle and Louisville tried these innovative student assignment plans, you probably know, that were struck down. So some places have struggled to find ways to get around that. I think the places that are doing it well, and I do think Denver's one example, is deploying two things at once together. One is a strong choice climate. What we know right now is school demographics pattern after neighborhood demographics. And so the fact that we still have deeply segregated neighborhoods means you still get deeply segregated schools. That means school choice creates the opportunity for you to create that integration if you're intentional about it. But only if you also do the second part, which is being deliberate about where and how you deploy schools and how you try to balance those populations. So some of the charters in Denver, like Denver School of Science and Technology, when they opened, they intentionally said, our goal is to have a diverse student body. And so they established and have kept two separate lotteries. They do a lottery for low-income students, and they do a lottery for everybody else. So when the school became the #1 high school in the state, and all of a sudden white families were lining up around the block to get in, you didn't overwhelm all the families of color in that neighborhood who still wanted to go there. And so I think the combination of choice and that balance, Denver has also done a great job of saying, you want to, when you have really strong brands, great charters, great district schools that are replicating, you want to open those in the neighborhoods that have the highest need. So you don't have the dynamic you have now, which is all the best schools are in the wealthiest neighborhoods and everyone's trying to get in. Now we have a lot of places where a lot of our best schools in the city are in some of our lowest income neighborhoods, and you have this great phenomenon of families from the wealthiest sections of town trying to get in to North Park Hill, which I think creates a more flexible dynamic of kids are moving everywhere. It's not all kids racing to get to one place, but I'm so glad you raised it. I think it's a huge issue for this generation of the movement to solve.
Anything you guys would add on this question?
I completely agree. There's one small thing I think that starts to get at this, in addition to what you said, Mike. One of the things we've looked at, and in fact, the U.S. Department of Education required every state to have an equity plan around teacher quality. And where are your teachers, your best teachers, and what schools are they in? And lo and behold, shocker, in New Mexico, we're in complete disservice to our kids that need great teachers the most. And so I do think there's a lever in addition to the ones you talked about as far as where are we placing our talent? And I think that we would be surprised what kind of movements we might see when we actually incentivize and see our best teachers in our most struggling schools.
And Hannah, are you also using that data? Because you've got a lot of schools that are integrated on paper if you look at the percentage of different kinds of students, but in fact, inside the school, they operate in a fairly segregated way in terms of course access. Are you guys using that data to try to get at that as well?
We are and have begun to look at multiple, we submitted a plan, yes we did, on multiple pathways to really look at how do we get the right teachers in, not just the right schools, but to your point, in the right classrooms as well, and the equal access at the same time.
I just have to, very quick story. I couldn't agree more with you about the purpose and the values you're talking about. I think of diversity both from a moral perspective, kind of a national identity perspective, and from an educational perspective. When I went to high school in Wisconsin, Shorewood High School, and I was in the sports editor of a high school newspaper, and I met a girl who had come from the Milwaukee City Schools, come to 9th grade, and wanted to write a story for our paper, and she was brilliant, and so I said, great. She submitted an article, and she couldn't complete a grammatically correct sentence. My editorial board laughed. How, John, do you think somebody, quote, like this could be a reporter for our paper? And I said, she's so brilliant. Wow, what had happened? And so I worked with her. We got her to write an article for the paper. I got obsessed, so I started doing stories. I went into the Milwaukee Public Schools to look at desegregation efforts in Milwaukee when I was in high school in the 1980s. There were supposedly, where there was efforts to desegregate the schools, what was just being talked about. The schools supposedly were integrated, but I went in, they're completely segregated within the school, and there were low expectations for kids of color who were separate from the higher expectations from mostly the white, more affluent kids in the school. And that propelled me on my entire journey of wanting to work in education. So I couldn't agree with you more on the purpose. I'm not going to have time to go on the policy levers. Mike's addressed those. But I will say that policy is just one lever. So for those of you who are teachers, in schools, community leaders, I think one way to think about this is what's the 20 or 30 year arc. And I think we actually need more schools, individual schools, that exemplify racially diverse, high quality schools that actually cherish and invest in their diversity, that actually people can point to more and more schools deliberately doing that to create more of a movement and community support for some of the harder policy issues over time. So you can't change the policy on this. If you can be part of an effort to create more schools that do this well and model it, I think that'll be a big contribution to the purpose and the policy over time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great question. And also, thanks for identifying yourself. Can you guys be sure when you ask a question to identify yourself over here?
Absolutely. My name is Corey Linehan. I'm a 2012 St. Louis alum. And I'm curious about something kind of specific. Often when we're looking at a given policy lever like desegregation or a different challenge, there are multiple procedural options that we can take to drive change. So the legislative process, initiatives, regulatory rulemaking, or impact litigation. And I'm curious, when we have multiple options for pursuing a particular lever, how you think about matching the right procedural process or the most appropriate and effective procedural process to that challenge.
Mike, why don't you're actually
That's a great question.
You're actually a real lawyer, so why don't you,
And this is another great thing for folks to realize, because you get a lot of times where people will come to the legislature and lobby me to change their district's compensation system. Right? Like, I don't have that capacity because that's a district function. So I think your point is extra important on first you have to understand what levers are available at what level of government. And so if you want changes to Title I, you can't come ask me, and you certainly can't ask your school board member or your principal. So I think for folks to think about, when you're thinking about the change you want to make, think about both, first identify what's the level of government that's in charge of that decision, and then what's your capacity for making a difference. I think this is really important because I think you tend to sometimes in government think that the solution to every problem must be a bill, and often it's not. Often it's a nonprofit. If we wanted to do better strategies for teacher recruitment and retention, we decided to incubate a nonprofit to do that rather than to pass a bill to mandate it. And so I think normally the two questions we ask ourselves are, what lever gives you the most likelihood of the longest term success on that change you want? And then what lever is the most politically feasible? Right? So I think, and in that order, you want to first say what gets you your best impact. So there are times where you can change regulations by going to the Department of Education directly, and Hannah can change them through her staff without you having to pass a bill, and that's more effective and often more directly related to the field. So, and then if you want to make a constitutional change, impact litigation tends to be your more better angle. And so we try to take a look at what's the impact you seek, what lever is likely to most directly touch this impact for the longest and most sustainable amount of time, and what's the most feasible.
Let me ask two follow-up questions on this. One is, are we going to see more court cases? I mean, so the Supreme Court, there's a major teachers union case that's been argued and now is pending a decision. The Fredericks case, you've got this Vergara situation in California and some other litigation like that. Like, are we going to see, do you think, the courts as more of a vehicle for education reform legislation and more of to the gentleman's question, more of a lever going forward?
I think what you're going to see is in places like California, where the legislature was not a viable option because they knew they didn't have the votes to pass policies like that, then the option becomes the court. So it's a minority-majority question. If there are coalitions with the political will to pass it, I think people will go towards legislatures. In places where there's a minority that feels like they have needs that can't be addressed by the political process, they'll try the courts. I do think you're seeing more of that.
And is that actually tees up the second part? Have we failed as a movement, if you will, to create sort of a sustainable politics? So we talk about these different levers, but people tend to come to Washington or they look to the courts because there's just not sort of a sustainable politics of education reform. And is that a failing of this movement?
I'll take a stab at that. I would say we failed at creating, and Mike started this conversation and your first comment, the ecosystem. And I'm a little bit slower to say fail as much as we better do it in the sense of we can have good policy, we can have all the things that we're talking about, but if we don't build an ecosystem, and this is very real for me, I've got 8 years. When I walked in the door, I thought I only had 4. That's a short amount of time when you're trying to really move change, and it's definitely not where you want to end, right? You've got to have an ecosystem outside of whatever role you get to play that continues, and I don't think we've done a great job across the board and across the nation and in the movement of creating ecosystems, but I think we're on a path to do that.
You make it sound like you were sentenced to 4 to 8, and you didn't get let out for good behavior after 4.
All of that.
John, I mean, as people come to Washington, 'cause that's the one level where sort of reform has more levers consistently, and at the state level it's tough, and at the local level, have we sort of failed to create a sustainable politics?
Well, I think, look, and I actually think if you look at the next year or two, I think it's indicative of what matters in education for the most part. It's not the presidential campaign. It's the campaigns for governor, for school boards, people becoming state superintendent, local superintendent. I think there is a federal role, and it's an important one, but the real shift in the decision-making within certain important federal frameworks, especially around equity, are going to be at the state level over the next couple of years in a very real way. And I think on the question on policy, I would just say that I think some of the lessons learned, I think there's 3 adjectives I would use to describe how I would think about policy, especially at the state level where this is going to come together over the next couple of years. Well, starting point, define what success is in the first place, what problem you're trying to solve, and see if you can get some unity with many voices around what you're trying to accomplish. I think often people take the step on policy without saying what's important. I do think the accountability discussion at the state level is going to be important, not accountability alone, but say, here's what's really important to us in the state. But then I would say it's got to be focused policy, it's got to be coherent across policy levers, and you got to be humble about it. And by focused, I mean people often in policymaking just write all these things that they have ideas about and think if you just write on a piece of paper, it's just going to happen somewhere. It's not how the world works. Before, Michael Barber has talked about you mandate improvements, but you unleash greatness. Now again, I think you invest in and unleash greatness, but you can't mandate a lot of this stuff. So you got to be focused on the few things that matter. Second, coherent. I think people often do the court case or the state policy or the local policy. It's not coherent. And what matters most is the interaction between kids and teachers in schools, at least in classrooms every day. When you got this proliferation of policies from different places, it's incoherent, and that's a huge problem. Like on testing, I don't think we have too much testing in this country. And you might say, well, didn't you say before there's excessive focus on testing? I think we have an excessive focus partly because it's not coherent. The issue is not amount, it's actually making coherent. So being coherent about your policy making is really important. And third is be humble. I think that, again, often people have big aspirations for how much you can accomplish through policy. I think if you focus on the few big things that matter to you, that you can, as long as you know the policy is ultimately going to be about enabling work at the local level. So I'd be humble about what you use policy for as a lever to try to accomplish.
Terrific. And the second quote from Michael Barber, and it sounds actually even better when Michael says it because he's British, so it sounds really smart. But it's well worth reading. It's a good, if you're interested in how this stuff works, Michael's thought about this deeper than almost anybody else. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm Greg Burrell, and I am a 1996 Baltimore alum. And, all right. So, first of all, thank you all for what you're doing, but especially, Andy, thank you for these great questions you've been asking. My question today is about magnet schools and charter schools, which is the way Baltimore was set up. At first they seem like a great idea, but they tend to have the effect of segregating the students whose parents can navigate the systems and bureaucracies, the lotteries to get their kids into them. So, and feel free to push back on my assumptions in the question. Do you feel that considering the inadequacy of education funding is segregating all the students with savvy parents the best we can do to educate our youth?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah, John, you and I were just talking about Baltimore the other day, so I know it's someplace you've taken a look at.
I was at a Baltimore school a few weeks ago talking to kids there. And again, I just think, on an aside, I just think you all do it, but the insights that all these questions, whenever I ask a kid about it, a student, I get more learning than anybody else I ask. So I'd ask these questions to kids in a city, both in charter schools and district schools too. But here's what I would say. Again, we have these pendulum swings, kind of go over here and then go over here. And you have the kind of these debates where people say, hey, this point, this point. I think that there's a book that was called, it's written by Jerry Porras and Jim Collins, called Built to Last. And there's a chapter in it called The Genius of the And versus the Tyranny of the Or. And I think often too much we have these debates in this or that. I think in this case, it's the genius of the end. First of all, anybody who focuses on charter schools, in my view, without focusing on the entire system and how every kid in that system and community will do, is really, it's the tyranny of the or, first of all, but it's shortchanging most of the kids in the system. That said, I think if you're in a system or state where you've got some really high quality organizations that are delivering and teachers and educators who've got great options for kids through charter schools, and you know what, we just want to focus on the school district. Let's not make room for high quality charter schools and for educators to create opportunities that can be R&D and push the system. I think that you're missing that too. So I think it's a both and then more specifically, I think people ask me what I think about charter school policy. It's a little bit sometimes about what you think about trade policy. It depends what kind of trade policy. And I think that there are different policies on charter schools in states and communities across the country which are very, very different. So in some places you can have, it leads to some very high quality schools with attention to how it's done in a way that doesn't undermine education for kids across the system. And in other places, I think you've got charter schools which essentially are a proxy for markets, where it's kind of insta-school, and you don't care about the implications of the system. So if you have time, I think going to the specifics of the charter school policy in a way that you actually leverage the fact that some of the highest achieving urban schools in the country right now, not all of them, but some of them are from charters, and there's got a lot to learn from that, how you kind of create that supply going and give more opportunities for communities and educators to create them. At the same time, if you don't pay attention to the impact on things like enrollment policy and discipline policy and funding for the whole system, so I think it's how you craft it at the state level that matters a lot for kids.
What would you guys add? And I mean, and when charters were sort of a sideshow, these questions were more marginal, but we're in a city where over 40% of the kids are in charter schools. We have multiple cities now in the country where they're majority charter, and one case pretty much all charter. And so these questions become, you know, as this grows. How do you all think about this question as the charter sector's evolved and grown?
Quick response, and thank you for the question. My own personal experience with that is, unfortunately, sometimes it's far too fair. Both of my kids lost the charter school lottery 2 years in a row, even though my best friend was the principal. And so it turns out, unfortunately, there is no rigging the system in Denver. But the benefit is, I do think John's right. For us, what was key is, because I ran a district school, I was a district school principal, and I had friends who were running charters. And one of the things that was so frustrating to me was when you are a district school principal, and I'd go to my charter school friends who were, doing culture building week for the first 4 days of school, and they take the kids out of the lottery, they all come in for the first 4 days, you put them through boot camp, they learn all the values, and for the rest of the year, you're set. Well, we did that. But then you have 5 more kids that enroll the next Monday, and the next Tuesday, and the next Wednesday, and by the end of our year, we have turned over our entire freshman class twice. So in a class of 100 kids, we've enrolled almost 220. And that is a totally different challenge, right? How do you build culture every single day of the year? And so our charters have changed their policies now in Denver, where they operate their attendance zones like any other neighborhood school. So if you move into that neighborhood because your family lost their job in Nebraska and you move in March, you walk in the door of that charter school and register the same way you did into my school. And so I do think John's right that it depends how you build policies. I'm really encouraged that in Denver we have some charters now who are really saying, hey, let's make all the things that we do, the enrollment, the registration, the admission, the same as every other school, just allow us some autonomies. And so I think we're graying the line now between what it means to be a charter or a district school, and I think that will help kids in the long term.
Why don't we stay over here? Yes.
Hi, my name is Cindy Garcia, and I'm a third-year teacher in Eastern North Carolina. And the question I have is about the level of respect given to the teaching profession. Many teachers I know are friends of mine, and many other teachers I've met are just really disillusioned and angry about the level of respect given to the teaching profession. So I wanted to know what types of policies or steps should be taken, or what types of policies and steps are working that are elevating the teaching profession, whether it's raising teacher pay or tying teacher evaluation to test scores.
Hannah, I want you to start just with your experience in New Mexico and sort of the evolving relationship there.
Yeah. So great question. So I said earlier I don't use the word failed very often. I think we've failed in this, in creating and continuing actually to honor the teaching profession in the midst of incredible change. But the fine point I put on that failure, I actually think it's a communications failure. And that sounds so like cheesy and PR-y and all that kind of stuff, but we have not communicated well in the midst of the change. I actually believe the changes that are taking place, whether it's teacher eval and aligning the pay to that, or new teacher preparation programs that have a completely different orientation that really do equip our teachers to be successful, which we've failed on that, by the way, in the past. I actually believe we have not communicated well in the midst. I think the changes that are happening do bring more esteem and respect to the profession over time, but we have to bridge that over time. And one of the biggest challenges in my role is this communication piece. How do you impart that?
So I think that it's a great question, and when Andreas Schleicher, who is a leader on education at the OECD, one of the kind of premier global analysts on education, says that the countries that have done well investing in the teaching profession have not done so because people think, oh, the culture of the country just value teaching, and therefore that. He said, well, that what's actually changed in those places are actually the policies in the country that actually make teaching a more attractive profession to go into. So I do think this is a communications question is very important. I also think a policy question is very important. And I think what's interesting on this, and it's crucial, and look, the work, what I said earlier at the beginning of the panel, the world's changed. The level of skills our kids need to succeed in today's economy is much higher. The standards, rightly so, are much higher to equip our kids. The job of the teacher in that is, like, it's unbelievably hard. And I was in a great classroom at Teacher of the Year in Chicago last week, and it was a work of art to see what she was doing. It was incredible, but it was very, very hard. So how do you professionalize teaching? I think the evidence is actually in systems. There's good data coming out of places like Washington, right here in Washington, D.C., or in Tennessee, where if you, DC, obviously the salary's gone up a ton. There has been a comprehensive approach to identify good teachers, develop teachers, of instructional leadership, and there's been teacher accountability as well, which there's research coming out that came out this week showing that's been an effective component of an overall system investing in teachers. The data shows that now in DC there are more people who want to be teachers, and in DC, teaching is a more attractive profession here in DC than before those policy changes. Now, there have been mid-course corrections along the way, there need to be more, but I think the principles of investing in high salaries, investing in teaching as a profession, reducing prescription, and giving scaffolding like good curricula, good professional development, and instructional leadership support teachers, those policies, I think, are proven to actually elevate the profession. We need more of those across the country.
Mike, what do you want to add?
I just want to add quickly, because I do think part of this is about reflective practice and owning where you've failed, and this is a place where I'm very aware that I've failed. Which is the thing that I was most excited about, in which gets very little press, in our teacher evaluation law, was when we passed the teacher evaluation law, as I said, the purpose of evaluation is improvement. So what we were most excited about was when you have this data on who are our best 7th grade math teachers across the state, what we wanted to do was to use that to create career ladders for teachers, so we could identify those folks and not pay them $5,000 extra because they taught well, but say, could we pay you $5,000 extra for you to share the genius that is in your brain? Would you become a master teacher? Would you become a lab teacher? Would you become an instructional coach? But all of those required resources, right? And so we passed the legislation with the policy. The policy included career ladders. We didn't have the funding to fund the career ladders. So what happened was a bill that was meant to be about investment in evaluation and investment in the expertise we could get from identifying those folks became about accountability and not about support. That was why we went back to the ballot 2 years later to try to pass this school finance initiative, which also included the funding to support the career ladders, and we failed at that. And so I think what we really need deeply in the evaluation conversation is an opportunity to really identify and celebrate the folks that are amazing in this work and elevate. You know, we had this idea of creating kind of a click-through system where you could download sample lesson plans from our best teachers, and they would get paid for every download, right? So you had like create viral rock stars of our best teachers, so you know, hey, did you hear about Miss Smith's lesson from Fort Collins? Because I think the real opportunity here is in dramatically elevating the voices of our best practitioners and having them be the one that you pay as a consultant to come and do your professional development, not the random drive-by person who hasn't been in a classroom in 10 years.
But is there a chance, though, guys, that this is, you always hear these conversations, yet a couple of data points. This country produces far more teachers than it needs, so people still want to go into the field. If you look at good comparisons and good questions that aren't cooked on surveys about job satisfaction, teacher job satisfaction compares incredibly favorably with any other field in this country. Like, I'm not discounting that there's problems, that teachers have been disrespected. I mean, honestly, I'll interject myself here. Like, you listen to their leaders, their teachers union leaders talk about the field. That's a dystopian view of, like, what teaching is about. Like, you're hard-pressed to find anybody who's sort of more gloomy about. But when you actually look at the data and you look at all these things that are happening, like, do we beat ourselves up too much? And to John's point, is some of this just anytime you have an industry in transition, it's really rough?
I think we had, at least I'll speak for Colorado. In Colorado, we had two competing narratives that hit at the same time that were really difficult. One was we had a lot of statewide conversation around standards and assessments and evaluations, and how we had to do more evaluations and make sure our schools were doing better. Then at the same time, we had massive budget cuts for 3 or 4 years in a row. So you had both this, we're going to ask you to do a lot more, and we're going to ask you to do a lot more with a lot less. So now you're going to have fewer instructional coaches, fewer assistant principals, fewer mentoring and supports. And so I think
that is when satisfaction on the job surveys dipped, was in the height of the downturn when there
it was like
real
9, 10
budget cuts happening.
9, 10, 11. So I think it was the confluence of those two. If we had said, hey, we're going to ask you to do a lot more, but we're going to be there to support you to doing it, I think folks would have been fine. I think it was us asking them to do a lot more than asking them to do it with a lot less was the hard combination.
Okay. I'm going to ask you guys, we're getting short on time, so I want to ask you guys lightning round, because you've got a lot of people. Everybody in this room is committed to social change. They wouldn't be here. They want to make the world a better place. That's why they do the work they do. You guys have been at this for 2 decades. None of us are getting any younger. What's your big, like, lightning round, 30 seconds, like, what's the biggest lesson you've learned, the thing that if you wish you knew when you were earlier on that you've learned and you know now? And Mike, I'll start with you, and John, one with you.
I was hoping you weren't going to start with me. Okay, 30 seconds. My 2 big takeaways are the best policy is informed by deep practice. And so if you want to have more of an impact on policy, go deeper into the work you're doing as a teacher and principal, because you'll find all the best lessons there, I think. The second is, the corollary to that is, I actually find in the legislature right now, there is not often a shortage of political will as much as there is a shortage of big ideas. There are, at least at the state level, it's very possible still at local school boards and state legislatures to make an impact. What you don't have are visionary types of leaders like you all the time, who have done the work, learned the lessons, want to make an impact, and say, you know what, you all have probably 10 4-year stints of your career ahead of you. You got 40 years of decisions to make. I would say absolutely take one of those 4-year stints and run for a state legislature or serve on your local school board. Take the knowledge you've accumulated, the work you've done, and find a way to shape the policy environment, and then come back. Because I think the better we get at this is the closer we bring the worlds of policy and practice together, the more likely you are to have policies that work for practitioners and practitioners who can drive good policy.
Okay, Hannah, 30 seconds. Your biggest aha that you wish you knew then that you know now.
It's twofold. One is, sitting in the seat I'm sitting in right now, I woefully underestimated human capital and the importance of it and how important people are in the mix. I thought I knew that, and I really, really didn't get how important. And so my plug is come to New Mexico. You're welcome. We need more great leaders. And then secondly, I would say, I said it a minute ago, communications. The importance of being able to get ahead. There are competing messages out there. And if you aren't in the game on talking and communicating about what you're doing, you can have the best policy in the world and not reach to your teachers who end up frustrated.
Okay, John, you got 15 seconds for what's something you wish you knew in the 90s that you've learned you know now?
I think, I'll go back to my first comment, I guess, is that the pressures that are on everyone working in education and kids come from the fact that the world has changed, and that what's expected of our young people now has gone up dramatically because of the changes in the workforce, in the country, and the pace of information, and the pace of change, and that our schools are neither failing nor they're fine. Sometimes this failing schools metaphor, it's wrong and it's demoralizing. It's not true. We've gotten better. But then there's this reaction that our schools are just fine, and like there's a resistance to change. No matter what the change is, let's just kind of, whatever the change is, let's wipe the change away and go back to some sort of placid state. But that's also wrong. I think what I've learned is the pressures are real. Our young people are going to succeed or not, particularly our low-income kids and kids of color, whose lives depend even the most on improvement. And the question is how do we actually get better faster? Innovate in a few places, get better faster, to make sure that we actually just keep up the constant improvement, as opposed to figuring we have to just fix some entrenched failure, which is not true, nor protect the status quo. And that's the opportunity in the next couple of years, including at the state policy level, and for all those of you who are creating proof points of success in classrooms and schools across the country.
All right. First of all, thank you all for what you do. Thank you for your attendance today, and thank you for those great questions. And please help me join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much.